The Omar Thompson story. He was a decorated Army veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. She was the FBI agent who arrested him for terrorism on American soil. 8 years later, Agent Jennifer Stone would realize that Omar Thompson hadn't been planning the attack, he'd been the only one who could have stopped it. Welcome to Justice System USA, where we bring you the untold stories of America's legal system. Before we continue with Omar's incredible story of heroism, prejudice, and the thin line between patriot and terrorist in the eyes of the law, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories of unrecognized heroes deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter, and your support helps us keep bringing them to light. The Warriors return. February 3, 2019, East Rutherford, New Jersey. Super Bowl Sunday dawned crisp and clear, with 80,000 football fans beginning their pilgrimage to MetLife Stadium for the biggest sporting event of the year. Among them was Omar Thompson, a 34-year-old former Army Ranger who had traded his combat boots for work boots after completing 3 tours in Afghanistan. Omar had earned his tickets to the Super Bowl through a veterans lottery program, one of the few perks that acknowledged his 8 years of military service. He had enlisted straight out of high school in Detroit, driven by the same patriotic fervor that had motivated young Americans after 9/11. The Army had given him purpose, training, and a brotherhood he'd never found anywhere else. But it had also given him something he hadn't expected, an intimate knowledge of how terrorists think, plan, and execute attacks. Omar had spent years in Afghanistan identifying improvised explosive devices, studying terrorist tactics, and learning to recognize the signs of impending violence. These skills had kept him and his unit alive through countless missions in hostile territory. Now, for years after his honorable discharge, Omar worked as a security consultant for various corporations in the New York area. His military experience made him valuable to companies worried about terrorism, workplace violence, and other security threats. But the transition to civilian life hadn't been easy. Omar struggled with PTSD, survivor's guilt over buddies who hadn't made it home, and the challenge of finding meaning in a world that seemed to have moved on from the wars he'd fought. The Super Bowl represented something special for Omar, a chance to enjoy a purely American experience, to celebrate the country he'd served, and to momentarily forget about the weight he carried from his military service. He had looked forward to this day for months, buying a new jersey and planning to meet up with other veterans who had also won tickets through the lottery program. What Omar didn't know was that his military training, his security expertise, and his knowledge of terrorist tactics were about to be put to the ultimate test, not on foreign soil, but in the heart of American entertainment. The discovery. Omar arrived at MetLife Stadium 3 hours before kickoff, planning to soak in the atmosphere and enjoy the pre-game festivities. As a security professional, he couldn't help but notice details that most fans ignored: the placement of barriers, the positioning of security personnel, the flow of foot traffic through various checkpoints. It was this professional awareness that led him to notice something that didn't belong. While walking through the lower concourse, Omar spotted a maintenance worker who seemed out of place. The man was carrying tools but not using them, checking locations but not performing any visible maintenance. Most concerning, he was accessing areas that maintenance staff typically wouldn't need to visit during an event. Omar's military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and everything about this situation felt wrong. The man's behavior reminded him of reconnaissance he'd observed terrorists conducting before attacks in Afghanistan. There was a methodical, purposeful quality to his movements that suggested advanced planning rather than routine maintenance. Following at a discreet distance, Omar watched the suspicious worker for nearly 20 minutes. The man visited 12 different locations throughout the stadium, each time spending a few minutes in areas that were hidden from general view but positioned near critical structural points or areas where large numbers of fans would gather. At the 7th location, Omar saw something that made his blood run cold. The worker was not performing maintenance, but was actually placing something inside a utility panel. From his vantage point, Omar could see enough to recognize the distinctive shape and configuration of an explosive device. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't routine maintenance or even petty vandalism. Someone was planting bombs throughout MetLife Stadium, and 80,000 people were about to walk into what could become the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. Omar's military training kicked in immediately. His first instinct was to call 911, but he realized that by the time he explained the situation and authorities responded, the bomber would likely complete his mission and disappear into the crowd. More critically, if this was part of a larger plot, alerting security too early might trigger the attack before authorities could locate and neutralize all the devices. Instead, Omar made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would follow the bomber, document the locations of the explosive devices, and attempt to prevent the attack himself, while gathering evidence that would allow authorities to stop the broader conspiracy. The hunt. For the next hour, Omar conducted his own counter-terrorism operation inside MetLife Stadium. Using skills learned in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, he shadowed the bomber while maintaining enough distance to avoid detection. He photographed each location where devices were placed, using his cell phone to create a detailed record of the threat. The bomber's method was sophisticated and terrifying. The devices were small enough to avoid detection during routine security sweeps, but powerful enough to cause catastrophic damage when detonated simultaneously. They were positioned to maximize casualties while creating structural damage that could cause the stadium to collapse, potentially killing everyone inside. Omar counted 12 devices total, placed at strategic points throughout the stadium's infrastructure. His military experience told him this was the work of someone with extensive knowledge of both explosives and stadium construction. This wasn't the random violence of a lone wolf, which was a carefully planned operation designed to cause maximum destruction. As the bomber completed his mission and began to leave the stadium, Omar faced a critical decision. He could follow the man and attempt to apprehend him, potentially losing track of his location and allowing him to escape. Or he could focus on the immediate threat to 80,000 innocent people and attempt to alert authorities to the bombs before kickoff. Omar chose to save lives. He broke off surveillance of the bomber and began the desperate race to warn stadium security before the game began. The misunderstanding. Omar's attempt to alert authorities went catastrophically wrong from the first moment. When he approached the nearest security station and tried to explain that there were bombs throughout the stadium, the guards initially thought he was joking or mentally disturbed. When he showed them photographs of the devices on his phone, their attitude changed to one of suspicion and alarm. To the security personnel, Omar's story seemed unbelievable and his behavior appeared threatening. Here was a young black man claiming to have detailed knowledge of explosive devices hidden throughout the stadium, carrying photographs that showed intimate familiarity with restricted areas and displaying an urgent intensity that suggested either mental instability or potential terrorist involvement. The fact that Omar was obviously knowledgeable about explosives and terrorism tactics made him seem more suspicious, not less. His military background, which he explained as the source of his expertise, was viewed as potential terrorist training rather than patriotic service. His detailed knowledge of the bomber's activities was interpreted as inside information rather than careful observation. When Omar insisted that authorities needed to evacuate the stadium immediately, security guards made the decision to detain him while they investigated his claims, but instead of treating him as a potential hero trying to prevent an attack, they treated him as a potential terrorist who might be providing information about his own plot. The situation escalated rapidly. When FBI agent Jennifer Stone arrived on the scene, Stone was a terrorism specialist with 8 years of experience investigating domestic and international threats. She had seen genuine terrorist plots and false alarms, and everything about Omar's situation seemed to fit the profile of someone involved in terrorist activity. Omar's military background actually worked against him in Stone's assessment. She knew that some military veterans had been recruited by extremist groups, and Omar's knowledge of explosives and tactics could be explained by either military service or terrorist training. His photographs of the devices suggested advance planning and reconnaissance that was more consistent with terrorist activity than with accidental discovery. Most damaging was Omar's inability to provide a convincing explanation for why he had been in restricted areas of the stadium or how he had managed to track the bomber for over an hour without being detected. His story of following a suspicious maintenance worker sounded rehearsed and convenient, particularly since no other witnesses had seen this supposed bomber. When Stone searched Omar, she found additional evidence that seemed to confirm her suspicions. Omar was carrying a tactical knife, a small radio, and handwritten notes about stadium security procedures. all items that could be explained by his security consulting work, but also fit the profile of someone planning an attack. The arrest, at 1:15 p.m., 15 minutes before the Super Bowl was scheduled to begin. Omar Thompson was arrested on suspicion of terrorism. As FBI agents placed him in handcuffs, he made one final desperate attempt to convince them that bombs were hidden throughout the stadium. "You have to evacuate," Omar pleaded as they led him away. 80,000 people are about to die, and you're arresting the only person trying to save them. But Agent Stone had made her decision. In her assessment, Omar Thompson was either a terrorist providing false information to create panic, or a disturbed individual whose claims had no basis in reality. The game would proceed as scheduled, and Omar would be interrogated to determine the true extent of any potential threat. From his position in the FBI Mobile Command Center, Omar watched in horror as tens of thousands of fans filled MetLife Stadium. The opening ceremony began exactly on schedule, with patriotic displays and military honors that made his arrest seem even more surreal. He was a decorated veteran, being held as a terrorist while the country it served celebrated its values in the very stadium he'd tried to protect. Omar's attempts to convince his interrogators that he was innocent became more desperate as the game progressed. He provided detailed descriptions of the 12 bomb locations, explained the bombers' methodology, and offered to guide authorities to each device. But his knowledge was interpreted as evidence of guilt rather than innocence. Agent Stone's questioning focused on Omar's military background, his current employment, and his political beliefs. She was looking for evidence of radicalization, extremist associations, or other indicators that might explain his transformation from soldier to terrorist. The more Omar protested his innocence, the more convinced she became that he was hiding something. The interrogation continued through the first quarter of the game, with Omar providing increasingly detailed information about the bombing plot in hopes of convincing authorities to search for the devices. But instead of validating his claims, his knowledge of explosives and terrorist tactics was treated as evidence of his involvement in planning the attack. The game that never should have been, Super Bowl 53, proceeded exactly as planned. Unaware that 12 explosive devices were hidden throughout MetLife Stadium, Omar watched portions of the game on television from his holding cell, knowing that, at any moment, 80,000 people could die because no one believed his warnings. The bombs were designed to detonate during halftime, when the maximum number of people would be inside the stadium and security attention would be focused on the entertainment rather than potential threats. But something went wrong with the terrorist plot. Either the detonation mechanism failed, the bomber was unable to trigger the devices remotely, or some other factor prevented the attack from occurring. Omar would later learn that the bomber, Vincent Romano, had been forced to abandon his mission when security began searching for suspicious individuals following Omar's arrest. Romano's plan had depended on being able to blend into the crowd and escape before the detonation. But the heightened security presence made that impossible. The Super Bowl ended without incident, with the New England Patriots defeating the Los Angeles Rams 13-3 in one of the lowest scoring championship games in history. 80,000 people went home safely, never knowing how close they had come to being victims of the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. But Omar Thompson remained in federal custody, charged with making terrorist threats and possession of information about explosive devices. The fact that no attack had occurred was interpreted not as evidence of his innocence, but as proof that his own terrorist plot had been thwarted by his arrest. The trial. Omar's trial began 6 months later in federal court in Newark, New Jersey. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Catherine Martinez, painted him as a radicalized veteran who had planned a terrorist attack on American soil. They presented his military background as evidence that he possessed the skills necessary to carry out such an attack, and his detailed knowledge of the bombing plot as proof of his involvement. The government's case was built on several key pieces of evidence. Omar's photographs of the supposed explosive devices were presented as reconnaissance photos he had taken while planning his attack. His presence in restricted areas of the stadium was characterized as advanced surveillance. His possession of tactical equipment was offered as evidence of his preparation for violence. Most damaging was Omar's own testimony about following the bomber and documenting the locations of explosive devices. The prosecution argued that this story was a cover for his own terrorist activities. that he had actually been planting the devices himself and had concocted the story about a mysterious bomber. When he was caught, Omar's defense attorney, Michael Torres, faced an almost impossible task. He had to convince a jury that his client was a hero rather than a terrorist, despite the fact that no evidence of the supposed bombing plot had ever been found. The FBI's search of the stadium had turned up no explosive devices, no suspicious materials, and no confirmation of Omar's claims about a bomber. Torres argued that Omar was a patriotic veteran who had risked his own safety to protect innocent lives. He presented evidence of Omar's military service, his decorations for valor, and his spotless record as a civilian. Character witnesses testified about Omar's integrity, his love of country, and his dedication to protecting others. But the defense was undermined by the absence of any corroborating evidence for Omar's story. If bombs had really been hidden throughout MetLife Stadium, where were they? If a terrorist had really been planning an attack, who was he, and why had he never been identified? The prosecution's narrative was simpler and more believable. Omar Thompson had planned an attack that was prevented only by his own arrest. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with Omar taking the stand in his own defense. His testimony was emotional and detailed, as he described his military service, his struggles with PTSD, and his desperate attempt to prevent a terrorist attack. But under cross-examination, Prosecutor Martinez highlighted inconsistencies in his story and challenged his inability to provide physical evidence of the bombing plot. "Mr. Thompson," Martinez asked during cross-examination, "if you really discovered 12 bombs in MetLife Stadium, why did authorities find no trace of explosive devices when they searched the locations you identified?" "Because the bomber removed them," Omar replied. "When I was arrested and security increased, he had to abort the mission and retrieve the devices to avoid detection." "That's convenient," Martinez responded. "The evidence of your alleged heroism disappears just as authorities arrive to verify your claims." The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a guilty verdict on charges of making terrorist threats and possession of information about explosive devices. Omar was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with the judge noting that his military service was an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating one. He had betrayed the very country he had sworn to protect. Prison and persistence. Federal prison was a special kind of hell for Omar Thompson. As a convicted terrorist, he was housed in a maximum security facility with other inmates considered threats to national security. Many of his fellow prisoners were actual terrorists, foreign and domestic extremists who had planned or carried out attacks against American targets. The irony was devastating. Omar found himself surrounded by the very kinds of people he had spent his military career fighting against. Worse, some of them knew about his case and viewed him as a kindred spirit, fellow warrior against the American system they despised. Omar refused to join any extremist groups or adopt any anti-American ideology. Despite pressure from other inmates and isolation from mainstream prisoner populations, he maintained his innocence and his patriotism, even when doing so made his imprisonment more difficult and dangerous. But prison also gave Omar something he hadn't expected: time to investigate his own case. Using the prison law library and correspondence with supporters outside, he began building a comprehensive file on unsolved terrorist investigations, white supremacist activities, and bombing plots that bore similarities to what he had witnessed. At MetLife Stadium, Omar's military training in intelligence analysis served him well as he pieced together information about terrorist cells operating in the northeastern United States. He identified patterns of activity, connections between suspects, and methodologies that matched what he had observed on Super Bowl Sunday. Most importantly, Omar began to develop a profile of the man he believed was the real bomber. Based on his observations at the stadium, the sophistication of the plot, and the timing of the planned attack, he concluded that the bomber was likely a white supremacist with military or engineering training who viewed the Super Bowl as a symbol of American multiculturalism that needed to be destroyed. Omar wrote dozens of letters to the FBI, providing detailed analysis of terrorist threats and offering information that might help solve other cases. Most of his letters were ignored, but some caught the attention of agents working on related investigations. Slowly, his insights began to contribute to a broader understanding of domestic terrorism networks. The break in the case. 5 years into Omar's sentence, Agent Jennifer Stone was assigned to a joint task force investigating white supremacist Terrorism. The assignment was both a promotion and a form of penance. Stone had been criticized for her handling of several high-profile cases, and her superiors hoped that success in combating domestic terrorism would rehabilitate her career. Stone's new role gave her access to intelligence files and ongoing investigations that had been outside her previous purview. As she reviewed cases involving potential stadium attacks, bombing plots, and domestic terrorism, she began to notice patterns that troubled her. Several white supremacist groups had been discussing plans to attack major sporting events, viewing them as opportunities to strike at diverse crowds while generating maximum media attention. The tactical approaches they were considering bore striking similarities to what Omar Thompson had described during his interrogation and trial. Most disturbing was the emergence of Vincent Romano as a person of interest in multiple domestic terrorism investigations. Romano was a white supremacist with military explosives training, who had been linked to several bombing plots that had never been successfully prosecuted. His methodology and target selection matched Omar's description of the Super Bowl bomber with eerie accuracy. Stone began to revisit Omar's case with fresh eyes, looking for evidence she might have missed or misinterpreted during the original investigation. What she found forced her to confront the possibility that she had arrested an innocent man while allowing a real terrorist to escape. The photographs Omar had taken at MetLife Stadium, which had been dismissed as terrorist reconnaissance, actually showed sophisticated knowledge of bomb detection and counter-terrorism procedures. His detailed descriptions of the bomber's movements demonstrated observation skills consistent with military training rather than terrorist planning. Most convincingly, Omar's behavior after his arrest was inconsistent with that of a guilty terrorist. Instead of maintaining silence or demanding a lawyer, he had continued to provide information about the bombing plot and had begged authorities to search for explosive devices. His prison correspondence showed ongoing efforts to help solve terrorism cases rather than any indication of extremist ideology. Stone's investigation took on new urgency when Vincent Romano was arrested in connection with a bombing plot against a federal building in Philadelphia. Under interrogation, Romano revealed details about his involvement in white supremacist terrorism that included oblique references to a failed operation during a major sporting event. The confession, Romano's arrest in 2025, marked the beginning of the end of Omar Thompson's nightmare. Facing life in prison for his role in multiple terrorist conspiracies, Romano decided to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession included detailed information about a plot to bomb MetLife Stadium during Super Bowl 53, a plot that had been abandoned when increased security made the operation too risky to complete. Romano described placing 12 explosive devices throughout the stadium, planning to detonate them during halftime when casualties would be maximized. The confession corroborated every detail of Omar Thompson's account from 6 years earlier. Romano described the same locations Omar had identified, the same methodology Omar had observed, and the same timeline Omar had reported. Most damning, Romano revealed that he had been forced to abort the mission and remove the explosive devices. After authorities began searching for suspicious individuals following some guy's arrest, Agent Stone realized with horrifying clarity that Omar Thompson had been telling the truth all along. He hadn't been planning a terrorist attack, he had been trying to prevent one. His arrest had actually saved 80,000 lives by forcing the real terrorist to abandon his mission. But Omar had spent 6 years in prison for his heroism. The revelation destroyed Stone's faith in her own judgment and forced her to confront the role that racial profiling and unconscious bias had played in her investigation. She had been so convinced that a young black man with military training and detailed knowledge of explosives must be a terrorist that she had ignored evidence of his innocence and missed signs pointing to the real perpetrator. Stone immediately began working to overturn Omar's conviction, but the legal process moved slowly. Omar had already served 6 years of his 12-year sentence, and proving his innocence required extensive investigation and corroboration of Romano's confession. Meanwhile, Omar remained in federal prison, unaware that the truth was finally emerging. His supporters had dwindled over the years, and he had resigned himself to serving his full sentence for crimes he hadn't committed. Only his unshakable belief in his own innocence and his continued love for the country that had imprisoned him sustained him through the darkest moments. Justice delayed. On September 15, 2025, Omar Thompson walked out of federal prison a free man. His conviction had been overturned based on Romano's confession and new evidence that corroborated his original account of the Super Bowl bombing plot. The federal government issued a formal apology and announced a settlement of $10 million for wrongful imprisonment. Agent Jennifer Stone was waiting outside the prison gates when Omar was released. The meeting between them was emotional and complex. She was the agent who had arrested him, but also the one whose investigation had ultimately proven his innocence. "I'm sorry," Stone said simply, tears streaming down her face. "I failed you, and I failed everyone in that stadium who never knew you saved their lives." Omar's response surprised her. "You were doing your job," he said. "You saw what looked like a terrorist and you acted to protect people. I can't fault you for that, even though it cost me 6 years of my life." But Omar's forgiveness couldn't undo the damage that had been done. 6 years in federal prison had taken a toll on his physical and mental health. He had missed the funerals of both parents, the weddings of friends, and countless moments that could never be recovered. His reputation had been destroyed, and his prospects for rebuilding his life were uncertain. The story of Omar Thompson's exoneration became national news, sparking discussions about racial profiling, the treatment of veterans, and the challenges of investigating terrorism in a diverse society. His case became a symbol of how unconscious bias and flawed assumptions could lead to tragic miscarriages of justice. Omar used his settlement money to establish a foundation supporting wrongfully Cone VICTED veterans and advocating for reforms in terrorism investigations. He became a speaker and consultant, sharing his experience to help law enforcement agencies improve their procedures and avoid similar mistakes. The real hero's recognition. Vincent Romano was convicted of multiple terrorism charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. His confession led to the arrest of several other white supremacist terrorists and the disruption of additional bombing plots. The investigation he triggered ultimately prevented dozens of potential attacks and saved countless lives. Omar Thompson was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his actions on Super Bowl Sunday. The citation recognized his heroism in preventing a terrorist attack that could have killed 80,000 people. Despite facing arrest and imprisonment as a result of his efforts, Agent Jennifer Stone left the FBI and became a victims' rights advocate, working to support people who had been wrongfully accused or convicted of crimes. She testified before Congress about the need for reforms in terrorism investigations and became a vocal advocate for addressing racial bias in law enforcement. The MetLife Stadium incident led to significant changes in how authorities investigate terrorism threats and evaluate intelligence from civilian sources. New protocols were established to ensure that potential heroes wouldn't be automatically treated as suspects, and training programs were developed to help agents recognize and overcome unconscious bias. The unsung patriot. Today, Omar Thompson lives quietly in upstate New York, working as a security consultant and veterans advocate. He never married or had children, dedicating his post-prison life to helping other veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life and supporting those who have been wrongfully accused of crimes. He keeps a photograph from Super Bowl 53 on his desk, not of the game itself, but of the crowd shots showing 80,000 people enjoying themselves in safety. It reminds him that his 6 years in prison had meaning, that his sacrifice had protected innocent lives even when no one knew or appreciated what he had done. Omar occasionally speaks at law enforcement conferences and military academies, sharing his story to help future officers and agents avoid the mistakes that led to his wrongful conviction. His message is always the same. True patriotism sometimes requires standing alone, and real heroes don't always get recognition for their service. "I didn't become a hero by preventing that attack," Omar tells audiences. "I became a hero by refusing to let 6 years of wrongful imprisonment turn me against the country I love." The real test of patriotism isn't what you do when everyone is celebrating you, it's what you do when everyone has turned against you. The case of Omar Thompson remains one of the most compelling examples of how the fight against terrorism can sometimes victimize the very people it seeks to protect. His story proves that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry badges, and that sometimes the most important service occurs when no one is watching and no one will thank you. What would you have done in Omar's position on that Super Bowl Sunday? When you see something suspicious that could threaten thousands of lives, when speaking up might make you look like the threat yourself. When doing the right thing could cost you everything, how do you choose? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And let us know what city you're watching from today. If this story moved you, subscribe to Justice System USA. We are committed to sharing the stories of unrecognized heroes, wrongful convictions, and the complex challenges facing America's justice system. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light, stories that remind us that heroism often comes with a price, and justice doesn't always come quickly. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the ones who look threatening, they're the ones who look harmless. And sometimes the most heroic people aren't the ones getting medals, they're the ones sitting quietly in prison, still believing in the country that failed to believe in them.